All right. Well, welcome everyone to the first webinar in the new BALLE Live webinar series on Local First. My name is Alyssa Barron-Mensa, and I serve as Managing Director at BALLE. We have several dozen communities from across North America registered for today's webinar, and we're delighted to have you all with us to kick off this new series. So I'm going to review a bit of housekeeping and provide a few reminders about this series, and then we'll introduce our topic and speaker for today. If you're dialed in by phone but you have not yet joined us in the webinar room, you can find a link in your reminder email from Ali Walker. Because of the number of webinar participants, we have the phone line muted. So if you have a question for the presenter at any time, you can type that question in the public chat window to the right of your screen. Stacy may answer a question during her presentations, but we'll hold most to the end of the webinar when we have time set aside for moderated Q&A. If you have technical difficulties at any point during the webinar, we have a slightly different process today than usual for folks who join our other webinars. If you're having trouble, you'll note that in the chat window along with your email address. And our staff member, Ali, will then email you offline to help you get your tech difficulty worked out. We also have a help link in our reminder emails for getting help directly from iLink if needed. After each webinar, we email everyone registered a link to a full recording of the webinar along with the presentation slides and a copy of the questions from the chat window. So watch for those materials in an email from Ali Walker over the next couple of days. So I'd love to describe a little bit more about this series. And I have a sneeze coming on, so I'll just excuse me in advance here if I have a sneezing fit. So this series is intended to feature innovative strategies at both the business level and the network level that effectively make the case for local and result in more buying and thinking local first. So every webinar will focus on tools and strategies you can take home and try out or make use of right away. We know that driving demand for local products and services are a critical piece of building the localist movement and taking Main Street mainstream. Locally produced goods and locally owned businesses have received a surge in support and awareness over the last several years, thanks to many of the Think Local First and Buy Local campaigns across North America. We continue to support this movement through showcasing effective models, campaigns, policies, and programs that expand local ownership and shift purchasing towards locals first. In November and December, we'll be focusing on next-generation local purchasing. That is, jump-starting local procurement by government agencies in November, and then in December on catalyzing local procurement by anchor institutions like hospitals and universities. We believe you don't have to be a big chain to have an edge when it comes to getting government contracts or receiving large orders. The problem with working with hospitals, universities, and other anchor institutions is that often navigating that process can be complex, and sometimes the deck is stacked against small business. So in November and December, we'll hear from local economy leaders at Local First Arizona, the Democracy Collaborative, and the Cleveland Foundation about proven and replicable approaches towards local procurement used across Arizona, in Cleveland, in Detroit, and beyond. So we suggest you treat these webinars as an opportunity to bring together a group of business owners, social entrepreneurs, lenders, philanthropists, anybody who wants to support locally owned businesses and local ownership in your community. After listening to the webinar, you might spend an hour discussing with your group the applicability and relevancy to your community, and you don't have to pay extra per attendee on the same webinar line. So we encourage everyone to use these webinars as a catalyzing tool in your home place, however you can. So full details about this series and our other series, including topics for upcoming webinars and registration links, are on our website, balocalist.org. So today we are really delighted to have Stacy Mitchell with us. Stacy, as many of you know, is a senior researcher with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and she directs its initiatives on banking and independent business. Her book, Big Box Swindle, The True Cost of Mega Retailers and the Fight for America's Independent Business, has appeared on several top 10 lists and was described by Bill McKibben as the ultimate account of the single most important economic trend in our country. So we could think of no one better to help us kick off this series than Stacy in helping us review not only all of the data that we've all started to use over the last decade or so of our work in making the case for local, but all of the new findings about all of the benefits that local first and local ownership can really confer on a community. And beyond being able to talk about these in kind of qualitative ways, really helping us all up the rigor in our collective work by being able to use and point to and when needed even generate our own data in making the case about why local matters. So with that, Stacy, I am going to turn it over to you to take us away. And I'm going to give you control of the slides here. Okay, you're all set.
Great. Thank you so much, Alyssa. It's just wonderful to be with you all. I'm a huge fan of all the work that the Local First groups do around the country and of BALLE, and so it's just really nice to be here today on a beautiful fall morning, at least here in Maine it is. I want to begin just with giving you kind of a quick tour of the ILSR website because we publish a lot of information, and it's a really, I think, handy resource for getting the kinds of things that can be helpful in your work. As some of you may know, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has been around for about 38 years, working on strengthening communities and building economic self-reliance and working to change public policy. Our website is organized around sectors, so you can see here if you see the blue band in the lower third of the website, banking, biomaterials, broadband. That's our main navigation bar, and much of the information, as I said, is organized by sector. One of the sectors that will be of particular interest to you will be independent business, but you may also find things in banking and energy. We do a lot of work around community-based renewable energy that may be helpful to you as well. If you click on one of those, so say you click on independent business, you go to the main page for that sector, and there are just a number of things I want to point out to you. Some of the resources include articles, resources, which are graphs and reports and that kind of thing. And also, in particular, under highlights, there's a link here to key studies on big box retail and independent business. And there we've got dozens of studies, including the ones that I'm going to mention today in the presentation. There's a link to the full study, but it's also, I think, quite handily, we have a paragraph summarizing what the findings of that study were. So you can very quickly sort of pull out key information that you need. It's a great way to, if you're giving a presentation or talking to someone and need those numbers at your fingertips, I encourage you to check out that page, and we're always adding to it and updating it. If you scroll down from here, you'll see some of the things that we're highlighting in that particular initiative area, some of the recent articles and other research that we're doing. One of the things we have highlighted right now in the independent business section is a story I wrote recently called Local Ownership Makes Communities Healthier, Wealthier, and Wiser. And this looks at some of the most recent studies that have been done around the ways that local businesses improve the overall well-being of a community, and in ways that many of us, even those of us who've been advocates of local businesses for a long time, might find quite surprising. For example, a recent study found that all else being equal, the more locally owned businesses that a community has, the better its level of public health. Its population is actually healthier, physically healthier. So this study found that more locally owned businesses equal better physical health, lower rates of obesity and diabetes, and even a lower mortality rate. And I keep, in my mind, running around that very last bullet point thinking, there ought to be like a slogan in there, so maybe it's buy local, you won't die, or as soon if we want to do truth in advertising. So what is the reason for this? How is it that locally owned businesses improve population health? And social scientists don't know exactly yet, but what their current hypothesis is that having a lot of local businesses in a community improves what they've termed the community's collective efficacy. And this basically just means the ability of members of a community to come together and work together for their mutual good. Communities that have lots of locally owned businesses, the thinking goes, have a higher level of collective efficacy, better able to work together for their common good. And other research has connected the collective efficacy of a community to better population health outcomes. And so the thinking is that's where the influence is coming from. Collective efficacy is a term that's closely related to another term you might have run across social capital, which is essentially a measure of the strength of the social networks in a community. And the more social capital, the stronger those social networks, the better able communities are to solve problems and also to innovate. And researchers have also, different studies have also found that communities that have lots of locally owned businesses have higher levels of social capital. And this plays out in things like higher levels of voting. So all things being equal, and these are studies that of course control for other things that influence civic participation, but those studies find that there's a larger level of voting in communities with lots of locally owned businesses, that residents are more likely to belong to community organizations, and they're also more likely to participate in reform or protest activities. So overall, there's this stronger kind of civic activism, if you will, in communities where local businesses are really prevalent. And there's a causality relationship here too. Social scientists have studied, what happens when large big box retailers come in and local businesses are displaced and disappear. They find those measures of social capital and civic well-being actually decline in response to that change. There seem to be a number of reasons why local business improves the civic and social well-being of a community. Some of it has to do with local business owners themselves, who are of course both financially and personally invested in the place where they do business, and often tend to be very active in various leadership and civic roles within the community, whether that's serving on local community boards or donating to charitable causes. Local business owners are often active participants in improving the well-being of a community. A second reason that communities seem to be, local business communities seem to be stronger is that having a lot of local businesses creates an entrepreneurial culture. When there's some type of disaster or some type of obstacle or challenge that a community faces, if the ownership of local resources and the decision making is local, those communities are much better equipped to meet that challenge and to figure out a way to overcome it than communities where the resources and the decision making are at some distant corporate headquarters and they're really dependent on outsiders to come in and solve problems for them. And the third way that local businesses improve the civic health of our communities is that they create the kinds of environments where we're more likely to interact with our neighbors. Studies have shown that if you shop at a farmer's market or in a local store, you're about 7 times as likely to end up in a conversation with another customer than if you're at a big box store. And of course those conversations are ways that we feel connected, that we exchange information, that we learn about different issues in our community, and that we become engaged and we become committed to the place that we live. So I wanted to start with this sort of social capital and civic health right off in the beginning of the presentation, in part because I think there's some really interesting new research that some of you may not have heard about that I wanted to share, but also because I think we often tend to treat the community benefits of local businesses as sort of a soft sell. It's sort of, oh yeah, and it makes our communities stronger. But I think that social capital is really critical to the health of the places that we live. I think the data about physical health of the population really points to that. That as we're trying to figure out how to solve big problems like obesity and diabetes and those kinds of health issues, that having communities that function better, function at a higher level in terms of problem solving is really critical. And this is only going to become more and more the case. We have big challenges on the horizon, whether it's in the form of climate change or resource scarcity, or some combination of the two. We're going to be, the civic functionality of the places that we live is going to become increasingly critical. Our ability to adapt to these changes, to be resilient, to come up with flexible place-based solutions is really going to depend heavily on how well our communities actually work, the level of collective efficacy. And that's, as I said, I think it's one of the really important reasons to have a large share of our economy be held by local businesses, because that's going to improve our ability to meet those challenges. So let's move on to some of the economic outcomes. For a long time, the story of big business has been, why is big business triumph? And the story has been, well, it's more efficient, it outperforms, it's more productive. That's the story that we've been told. A lot of what the Institute for Local Self-Reliance does is go through sector by sector of our economy and really look at that question. Do we get better outcomes from big business or local business? And what you find when you really begin to look is that that story doesn't really hold up. There is a lot of evidence to the contrary. And just to give you a sense of this in a few different economic sectors, we know, for example, that small farms produce more than twice as much food per acre as big farms. And I don't know how many of you saw the news. I think it was about a week ago. New information came out to say that food stocks are at a near 40-year low globally. And a lot of this seems to have to do with the droughts and the other problems that we're facing around the world. Monoculture is not very adaptable. Diversity has always been Mother Nature's sort of solution to how to adapt, and I think it should be ours too. So there's a lot to recommend small farms in terms of their ability to produce food effectively and in large volume for their neighbors, larger volumes than big businesses can. In banking, the story is pretty similar. If you look closely at the data and at the evidence, what you see is that locally owned banks and community-based credit unions are much better at being able to finance the real economy than big banks are. Local banks have a lot of information, sort of soft information, if you will, that enables them to make much better decisions about risk and particularly about the risk of whether a new business will succeed or fail. Local banks get to know the borrowers face to face. They know the local market intimately and whether this new venture is likely to succeed. Big banks are making decisions based on credit reports and computer models, and they're making those decisions in regional and national offices, and they're really disconnected from local communities. And so they actually have a very tough time making these nuanced judgments about whether a business is likely to succeed or not. And so rather than end up with a bunch of bad loans on their books, what they've opted to do instead is to sharply curtail small business lending. Big banks do very little small business lending, and local banks do a lot of small business lending. So we have a kind of structural problem that has occurred in our financial system, and many of you have heard, or read or know from your own work in your own communities that a lot of small businesses are really struggling to get the financing that they need. Recent surveys show nearly half of all small businesses have been unable to obtain loans. And that has been made worse certainly by the recession, but it's really a much deeper problem, and it's namely that as bigger banks take over more and more of the banking system, the amount of credit available to small business is shrinking. And to solve this problem, I think we really need to tackle the issue of big banks head on. There's a lot of interesting things happening with crowdfunding and alternative investment strategies and so on, and that's all to the good, and that's terrific, but it's going to be a long time before that gets anywhere near to the kind of scale that we need. Just to give you a sense, banks provide about $650 billion in loans to small businesses. So that's a big, tall order to fill, and I think we really need to focus on making sure that our banking system is healthy in order to solve what is this severe problem of lack of credit for small businesses. The problem that these surveys show is also holding back job growth. So just to put some numbers on this, it seems like a lot of information to absorb all at once, but if you just look at the chart on the left to start with, where it says share of bank assets, so this is kind of breaking down the market share held by different sized banks. And what you can see is giant banks, those that are over $100 billion in assets, there are about 18 of these banks nationwide. They now control 60% of the industry. Small and mid-sized banks are down to about 21%. Those would be sort of your community banks, your local banks. And then if you look on the right, you can really see what I'm talking about with regard to small business lending. Even though the giant banks have 60% of assets, they're only doing about a quarter of all the small business loans. And a lot of what they're doing are actually credit cards, which they count as small business loans. And then you can look at the small and mid-sized banks and you see that even though they're a small share of the overall assets, they're doing like the lion's share of small business lending. Studies show that the stronger your network of local banks, the more small businesses in your region, and the faster the job growth. So all of this is to say, the story we've been told about big banks is that, oh, they're more efficient, they're better for everybody, they're better for our economy. But when you really begin to look, it turns out that local banks are much better at doing the thing that we most need banks to do, which is to finance business growth and finance economic activity. And then just turning to retail, For a long time, we have assumed that big box retail is, a bargain. It certainly sort of seemed like it to a lot of people at first, but we now know that it's costing us far more in lost income than it's actually saving us. Big box retailers and chain retailers in general are eliminating a lot of jobs, and they're also lowering wages. So one of the ways that happens are just retail jobs. So this is there's been a lot of analysis of this. This is from a big national study done by some economists at UC Berkeley, who looked at, UC Irvine, who looked at what happens when a big box store opens in a community and found that the number of retail jobs actually declines overall because there are so many more jobs lost at local businesses than are gained at that new store. But the more important point that I want to make here is about the sort of ecology of how a local economy works. If you think about it, when you've got local retailers, the dollars that they take in, they then turn around and are spending at all of these other local businesses. So they're getting their accounting done locally, they hire a local print shop, they advertise in a local newspaper, supporting journalists that way. They may source goods from regional and local producers and manufacturers. So they're re-spending a lot of that money in the local economy. And what you see here is a sort of a whole ecology and a sort of interconnected web of businesses and jobs, including a lot of middle income jobs, right? And this is sort of the backbone of the middle class, small business, domestic manufacturing, and so on. When chain retailers come in, this whole ecology is really just wiped out. All these middle income jobs are eliminated, and all we get are very low wage jobs working in their stores. This is in a nutshell, what has happened to the American middle class. And we were all reading in the news and elsewhere about how the middle class is really shrinking. We've got growing ranks of working poor, and this pretty much explains how it is that has happened. So, not really such a great bargain when you begin to look at the loss of income. There are, as many of you are undoubtedly aware, a lot of studies that have quantified that extra spending that local businesses do in the local economy. It's sometimes referred to as the multiplier or the local premium. This is one such study from New Orleans done by Civic Economics, a firm that has done a number of these studies. They're incidentally all summarized on that key studies page that I mentioned on our website. This one looked at I believe it was a Target store and then a group of locally owned retailers, and found that for every $1 million in sales that came into those businesses, the local retailers were creating twice as much local economic activity and income. Here's another one more recently done in Salt Lake City, also by Civic Economics. This one happened to find that that the local premium was 4 times as much when you spent that money at a local retailer. All of these studies vary a little bit depending on the specific mix of the types of businesses that are included, but they all come to basically the same conclusion, which is that local retailers create 2 to 4 times as much local economic benefit for every dollar they take in than national chains do. And this can really add up. A city of 100,000 people does about $1.4 billion in retail sales a year. So you begin to think about redirecting even a small portion of that stream of spending from chains to locally owned businesses, and you can really start to gin up a lot of additional economic activity in your community. I live in Portland, Maine, and we had one of these studies done by a firm here a year or two ago. And they concluded that just a 10% shift in our spending, and we're a pretty small community, would result in an additional 874 jobs in the community. Then I want to touch a little bit on the issue of price, which is something we often hear. Don't big businesses save us money? Aren't chains cheaper? And that sort of thing. How do we address those questions? there are basically three levels at which I tend to address that question. The first level is that local businesses are not, in fact, more expensive in all cases. There are a lot of particular areas in which they're cheaper. So for example, small banks and credit unions charge much lower fees on checking accounts than big banks do. They also charge lower interest rates on loans. So small banks and credit unions happen to be cheaper. There are lots of examples of this in retail. For example, Consumer Reports a couple of years ago came out with a study that looked at where should you buy an appliance, small appliances, big appliances, and concluded that the best, not only the best service and selection, but also the best prices were at independent appliance stores, not at Home Depot, not at Walmart, not at Costco, but at independent appliance stores. There are a number of sectors where independent retailers belong to buying groups, and appliance stores are one of them. Almost all independents belong to a regional buying group of sorts, so they're getting volume-based discounts, and often manufacturers are very interested in working with them because they want to keep a diverse marketplace. They don't want to end up with just one or two customers for all of their products, so they want to keep the independents going. And so independents actually have access and are able to be just as competitive. There are other studies in some other sectors that have found similar things, in the hardware sector, for example, where again, there are buying cooperatives, a mix of products from a locally owned hardware store is often comparably priced to a mix of the same products from Home Depot or Lowe's. So the first thing, as I said, is that local businesses are not, in fact, always more expensive. Sometimes they're actually the cheaper or the better options. The second way that I often address the issue of price is to point out that we're not always comparing apples to apples when we're doing this. So for one example of that is that you could go into a Walmart store and you could buy a pair of Levi's jeans, and you will probably pay substantially less for that pair of Levi's jeans than you would if you bought Levi's at a locally owned clothing store. But those are not the same jeans. Levi's has come up with ways, as many other manufacturers do, they make separate lines for the big boxes from what they make for independent stores. And the lines that they make for independent stores are far more durable. So you're getting a different product. And if you buy something at a big box store and you pay half as much, but it only lasts, a third of the time that the competing product would last, then you actually haven't saved money. You're actually paying more. I bought a vacuum cleaner a couple of months ago, and had this sort of same conversation with an independent retailer, and ultimately, because I was curious about it, a distributor of vacuum cleaner parts who said, yeah, it looks like the same, may have the same brand on it, may look kind of like the same vacuum cleaner, but what you don't know is the one in the big box store has plastic parts inside instead of metal parts inside, those kinds of things. In addition to serving as a way to kind of confuse us about price and make us think that the prices at the big box stores are lower, this is also an enormous environmental impact associated with this, because as these companies have kind of taken over more of the retail market, we're buying more and more stuff and throwing out more and more stuff as it wears out. I wrote an article for Grist magazine about this about a year ago, and some of the statistics that I pulled up just kind of floored me. Back in 1990, the average American bought 28 items of clothes a year. Today we buy 59 items of clothes a year on average, so it's doubled. And we're also throwing out about 4 times as much textile waste every year as we used to, about 83 pounds per person. So we're going from factory to landfill in like a record time with these cheap products, and that's something I think to really think about when we're talking about price and thinking about value, really, ultimately. And then lastly, so once you sort of take into account the fact that we're not really comparing apples to apples and so on, what you discover is that the low prices that big box retailers offer are only at best slightly lower than independent retailers. And then when you, on top of that, begin to consider all of the community costs and the job costs and the loss of income, I mean, the only thing I think you can logically conclude is that this isn't really a bargain at all. We're actually worse off with this model. I titled my book "Big Box Swindle" really as a way of kind of encapsulating what I think about how this actually works. And I would just quickly add, I don't want to go into this in any detail, but in thinking about sort of the benefits to you as a shopper or patron of local businesses, there's also a lot to be said for the quality of service and the knowledge and really passion about what they do that locally owned businesses bring to what they do. We know, for example, that independent pharmacies offer far better health care, better service, more screening options, and so on. Consumer Reports, again, has done a number of analyses on where should you go for prescription drugs, and they consistently conclude that your best choice is an independent pharmacy. And we can see this across different sectors of retail. Locally owned toy stores are often run by people who really care about childhood development and education, and who have a very deep knowledge of how toys are important to childhood development, and so they're stocking things that they really believe in, and they're a rich source of knowledge. You're not going to get that if you're buying toys on Amazon or from Target. And then lastly, I just want to touch really briefly on some of the environmental implications. I think in a lot of these sectors we kind of, economic sectors we kind of know intuitively. I think one area where we can think more about and use more and publicize more is the importance of locally owned retailers in terms of reducing land consumption and automobile use. Local businesses that are small scale and integrated into neighborhood business districts or into downtowns require far less in terms of land resources than these big sprawling chain stores require. And also because they are within walking distance often of homes and neighborhoods, they're also a great way to help reduce the amount of driving that we're doing. And of course driving is one of the leading contributors to global warming. There was a study done a couple of years ago in King County, Washington, which is basically Seattle and its surrounding areas, and found that neighborhoods where there was a certain level of density and a lot of local businesses that provided grocers and pharmacies that provided kind of everyday needs, the people in those neighborhoods actually drove 26% fewer miles each year than people in neighborhoods that didn't have local businesses. So this is really, as our cities began to talk, our city councils began to talk about being more sustainable and all this sort of thing, bringing back local businesses and filling up those neighborhood business districts is really a great strategy. If you want to read more about this and other studies that have looked at this, there's an article on our website called Neighborhood Stores, an Overlooked Strategy for Fighting Global Warming. I would also recommend a report I published earlier this year on Walmart's greenwash, kind of looking at the company's sort of sustainability campaign. And in doing that, there's a lot of data in here on the retail system. Some of the data that I gave you about products wearing out more quickly, for example, what you'll find in this report, as well as a much more in-depth discussion of the whole driving issue and everything. So definitely check that out. And then I just want to end lastly by talking a little bit about how we measure success as a sort of local economy movement. And I want to point out that as we've had this sort of growing number of buy local campaigns, local first campaigns that are really having an enormous impact. As Alyssa said at the beginning of this webinar, the level of public awareness and support for local business has grown significantly in the last few years. ILSR does a survey every year, or has for the last 5 years, and we've consistently found that businesses in communities with strong local first campaigns are outperforming independent businesses in communities that don't have those campaigns. And we're hearing a lot anecdotally from business owners who are saying, yes, I've got people who are coming into my business more often, or who have made a deliberate choice to shop local because they have heard about the benefits, and they've really come to believe that this is a critical thing to do. So this is really, really a remarkable shift, and it's quite wonderful. And we're beginning to see it play out in a number of real ways as well. The number of farmers markets in the U.S. has more than doubled since 2004. We've had over 500 new independent bookstores open since 2005. Really pretty remarkable. There are long dormant factory buildings in New York and San Francisco that are now filling up with small-scale clothing makers and beer brewers and all of these new producers that are producing primarily for a local market. In the last year alone, we've had over 600,000 people move their accounts from big banks to local banks and credit unions. So there is something real out there going on. It's really quite significant, and we should be quite proud of all the roles that we've all played in bringing that about. Here's the thing that I want to just leave you with to think a little bit about. Is the fact that as remarkable as these trends are, there's still a pretty small thing happening kind of on the margins of the economy. So just looking at the food system, for example, we've had this remarkable growth in local food, but it's still, it's sort of a few percentage points. In that same space of time over the last 12 years or so, Walmart has gone from being a pretty small player in the grocery industry to capturing 1 out of every $4 that Americans spend on food. And we've seen kind of the same thing playing out in the banking industry. This is what banking looked like in 1995. You had this really diverse mix of small banks, medium banks, large banks, giant banks. The market was fairly divided among all of these different size institutions. By 2007, right before the financial crisis, giant banks had upped their share to about half of the market. Everybody else's share shrank. And here's what I think is really disturbing. Since 2007, this is what's happened. Giant banks have expanded their share to 60%. And when I say giant banks, it's really 4 big banks, some of whom, including Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase, are now, each of them are each bigger than all the small local banks in the country combined. So I say this not to really to end on a down note, but I want to say it as a way of sort of underscoring the importance and the urgency of what it is that we're doing and of the educational message that you all and we are working to get out there. But also to say it as a way of, that we really need to begin to communicate not only as a message to consumers, but also to begin to talk more to policymakers, local and state and federal policymakers, about changing some of the underlying policies that are really driving our economy towards big business and that are undermining the ability of small businesses to survive. Small business is very popular, local banks are very popular, but it's very difficult in the kind of policy environment that we have for local businesses to be able to expand despite their growing popularity. So as I said, I think I wanted to sort of close there as a way of saying what we're doing is making real progress, and it's a pretty remarkable shift that's happened, but we've got a big challenge in front of us, and the more resources that we can, sort of more energy and so forth that we can bring to bear on that, on mobilizing business owners and the public to really press for some big changes in how our system works is really critical. In addition to doing a lot of research and writing about the local economy, ILSR, also a big part of what we do is public policy analysis and advocacy, and this is really the topic for another webinar, but just sort of FYI, we have a thing on our website called the Rules Library, and it's a collection of hundreds of model policies organized by sector of the economy and also whether it's a local, state, or federal policy. So this is a really rich resource if you're looking to do more policy work. And finally, I would just encourage you to sign up for our newsletters. We publish a number of newsletters. I do a monthly one called the Hometown Advantage Bulletin if you want to keep up with the new research and articles that I'm putting out. And you can also sign up for newsletters for each of our different sectors, as well as we do an ILSR general newsletter once a month. It's just the highlights if you just want to kind of keep up with just the highlights. So that is our website, and with that I will turn it over to you for questions.
Thank you so much, Stacy. So I'm sure as our participants are processing through all the information, I'll just have a couple of suggestions here. Stacy's walked us through some resources on her website. I really highly encourage folks to check that out. She also does a lot of writings about her own research and the latest additional findings, and so we feature a lot of that in the BALLE newsroom and of our social media channels. But the ILSR website has a kind of a great clearinghouse with all of that collected. I'll remind everybody that you'll get the webinar recording in the next day or two. So if you're like me and you've been furiously taking down notes and you want to go back in and be reminded of the different statistics and studies that Stacy has pointed to, that's coming as well. And I encourage all of you to take great advantage of this time we've got with Stacy Live for any and all questions you may have. So the first that was served up, Stacy, is if you can clarify who did the study connecting local businesses with clinical health outcomes.
Yeah, so that was done by a group of researchers. The lead author, I believe, was Troy Blanchard. Charles Tolbert was another one. It was published in the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy, and Society. And it was published about a year ago. And what I will do right now is I will send a link to the article that I wrote about this, and there's a link within the article to the actual study so you can download it.
Oh, perfect. That was pretty impressive multitasking there. While you talked, you got the link in there. Thank you. That's in our chat window now. Now, what about Canadian research? Of course, BALLE works across North America, and yet our folks in Canada often find that there's more great data piling up in the United States than Canada. So does ILSR do Canadian research? And if not, who else might you point to for great data for our northern collaborators?
I don't run across a lot of Canadian research, and I'm not sure if that's because I'm not looking in the right places or if there's really just not as much being done. We occasionally will run across something interesting to report from Canada, some interesting initiative that they're doing in some community or some piece of research, and we do put that out on our site and in our newsletter. I also do a lot of, I write fairly regularly about things that are happening in the UK and to some extent the rest of Europe, because this is obviously an issue that they're facing as well, and there's some very interesting approaches that they have that are quite different from what we've seen in North America. So we do try to bring some of those perspectives in to our work when we can, though I have to say with regard to Canada, I don't see as much, and I'd certainly welcome if you run across anything, send it to me, and we'd certainly love to feature it.
So we'll need to keep doing what we can on our end to be encouraging research there, it may be in partnership with our Canadian networks. I have a question. As you're making the point, and I have your image of the blue jean store in my mind, and you talk about getting a different product from independent retailers than from chains. Could you talk a bit more? You gave a lot of examples about how that might work, about some of the studies or the sources of information where folks could go to find out more about that trend?
Yeah, so it's a difficult area to really get to the bottom of for the reason that manufacturers who are the ones that are doing this, who are making these different lines for different customers, different retailers, don't really want to talk a lot about it publicly because they're afraid of pissing off their biggest customers, the Walmarts and Targets of the world. So as you can imagine, it's not something that they go out of their way to mention, and so it can be very difficult to kind of figure out what's happening and what's going on. There's a chapter in my book, in Big Box Swindle, where I talk, there's a whole chapter on the price question and where I talk at some length about how this works and do have some examples in there. You can kind of play with it yourself if you have a smartphone. You can download one of those barcode applications that allows you to scan a barcode and then see if another retailer is offering it for a lower price online, which is, a sort of nasty little thing that the chains have created to, kind of free ride off of independent businesses. But you can take that into, say, a Target store or Walmart store, and if you start scanning barcodes, what you'll often find is that the products on their shelves you can't get anywhere else because that particular blender or whatever it is that you're looking at is made just for that retailer. And it might look kind of the same, but you can't necessarily compare it. So a lot of it's sort of about being a more aware shopper. Also, report I mentioned, Walmart's Greenwash, that's actually came out of a series that I wrote for grist.org earlier in the year. It was a whole series on Walmart's sustainability campaign. One of the articles in there was an article called, Is Your Stuff Falling Apart? Blame Walmart, or something to that effect. But that's an article that goes and looks at this, the decline in product quality, and also looks at how the decline in product quality is actually a specific competitive strategy that big box retailers use. By lowering the overall quality of products, they actually get an edge over independent stores. The article talks about in some more detail, but it also gives a lot of that data. I talked a little bit about how much clothing we now buy and how much clothing we throw out. There's also a lot of other data points in there about how quickly appliances and other kinds of products wear out now than they used to.
I'm so fascinated by that. So you began by talking about these stories that we have as a culture about how small can be inefficient. And so the reason Walmart or others can offer such cheap prices is they've got this grand economy of scale. And we start poking holes in that and realizing, as you've walked through, that there's all sorts of places where that breaks down. And this is one piece that maybe we haven't talked about a lot, is the planned obsolescence, or actually just things that look similar but may actually be a lower quality product, and that's part of what can go into that really low price.
Yeah, that's right, because the economies of scale really top out pretty soon. Like if you have a group of, I mentioned the independent appliance stores, if you have a regional group, a statewide group of appliance stores, they're actually buying in about the same, they're maximizing their ability to get a discount based on volume. So Walmart's volume isn't really what drives its strategy. It's more about driving prices down by pressuring manufacturers to cut corners. They're also pretty efficient about their distribution. I mean, that is something that does help them lower costs, but a lot of it, again, is about what they're able to do in terms of pressuring manufacturers to cut those corners. And what ends up happening is not only do you end up with lower quality products that aren't really comparable, but the manufacturers in turn, as they sort of struggle, they sometimes have to raise prices on other companies that they're selling to. And so it's much more an effective market power than it is any inherent efficiency.
Thank you. And I know you've noted that in addition to your, having some information about this in your book and in the more recent Grist writings, but also the recent report on Walmart on greenwashing. So thank you for all of that. We've got another question here about tax breaks and other subsidies that big boxes get compared to locals, and how that affects local tax revenue. So of course this is a huge area of work and research. There's a whole organization. I point folks to Good Jobs First, which really does a lot of research and kind of expose work around trying to tie subsidies to performance. But could you speak a little bit about that, tax breaks and other subsidies for chains versus locals?
Yeah, I mean, we give huge subsidies and tax breaks to big retailers. No one knows exactly how much it amounts to, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of hundreds of millions of dollars a year that these big companies pick up. Walmart alone has picked up over $1 billion in local subsidies in the last 10 years or so. We also, many of our states have loopholes that enable chain retailers to get out of paying state corporate income taxes. If you're a small business, you can't get out of paying state corporate income taxes, and there are also offshore tax havens that big businesses can take advantage of. The reason that small business has been in decline is only partly because of consumer choices. A lot of it has to do with these policies that are really creating an unlevel playing field. So we advocate for, and you can find information on our website, I mentioned the rules library. So if you go there, you can find information on leveling the playing field in terms of tax loopholes, how to close tax loopholes, and also some examples of places that have adopted policies that prohibit subsidies for big retailers. So those can be a couple of really useful if you want to get started doing some policy work locally, advocating that your state or even your city council pass a policy that says there can't be subsidies for local retailers, and also working on closing some of those tax loopholes if your state has them. And you, as I said, you can research that on our site and find out. Those are great places to start in terms of making a better playing field for local businesses.
Great, thank you. And Susan, I see you've asked a question about BALLE used to have on our old website kind of a page that went over all sorts of different studies and had summaries of those studies. And we've been kind of rebuilding out on the new site all of our resources. So I know the study you're talking about, and I would be happy for you and anybody else who pipes up in the chat room to send you some of those details as we continue to get them repopulated on the new site. And in the meantime, Stacy, the study that you referenced today about kind of community health, that's on your key studies site?
I'm not sure if that one is, but it's on that link that I sent.
Up at the top. Here we go. Local ownership, healthier, wealthier, wiser.
Yeah, and that's also
Great.
got links to another study about social capital, and there's some studies on the higher levels of income as well, going with local business.
Great. So if anybody else has specific questions about particular studies, you should feel free either to pipe up about them now where you can find them, or send me an email, Alyssa, ALISSA, at bealocalist.org, and I can either point you to where I know they are or forward you along to Stacy. But if anybody's trying to track down something that you know is there, by all means use us as a resource. One of the things, Stacy, I think we've gone from individual cities doing studies about the impact, say, of a 10% shift in retail purchasing and how many jobs that could create and how much additional income from a community, to there being aggregate studies that look at many different cities and the impact of local ownership across a number of different communities. Could you speak, I'm thinking of the Indy City Index, or American Express did a multi-city urban study last year. Are those the kinds of things that are referenced on your key studies index? And then how would you suggest folks use the kind of individual city studies versus these kind of multi-city studies?
Right. Well, the Indy City Index, which Civic Economics did, really looks at what is the market share of local businesses in different metro areas. So it was really ranking our metropolitan regions on which ones had sort of the strongest independent businesses. I would love to see that study done where it's a finer grained geography, so really looking at cities versus, because in a lot of the cases the metropolitan area lumps together cities and their suburbs, and so it's too big of a geography necessarily to really get a fine-grained look at which places really have strong local businesses. But it's an interesting thing to look at. We also have a couple of articles on our site that look at census data. So for example, if you go to the independent business section of our site and click on resources, we have a number of graphs in there that break down the share of the economy that's held by independent businesses and how that's changed over time. So that can be some useful kind of benchmark data in terms of getting a sense of where the nation is and where our metropolitan areas are in terms of the overall health of independent businesses.
Great, thank you. And Susan, there's a second part to Susan's question about, hey, we don't have a specific local study in our community, and and so how do we make this case, with the data that is there in a way that's really valuable? So part of that, as we've been exploring, is understanding the whole range of studies that have been done and in other places and how we can reference them. But an additional tool that I'll suggest folks check out if they haven't already for starting to make the case using data in your own home place is our leakage calculators. So that you can find information about them on our website, bealocalist.org. But the way leakage analysis works, it's an awful term from economic development, but you're basically looking at the percentage of different sectors of your economy that could be localized easily. That is, you've got the capacity in your place to localize that industry. And the calculators then give you a sense of the jobs and the income that you could create were you to localize to X extent. So you can do that across an economy. You can go deep in food. You can go deep in finance. There's a lot of folks that will hire researchers to do that. It might cost $5,000 per study. And so the intent of the calculators is to make that approachable for every community for under $100. So that's another way to start using some data to make the case in your own place, as well as augmenting from all of these research from other communities. So I see a question from Jan. Are there any studies that show the hidden leakage due to increasing use of debit cards and the lack of local processing? And this is a question Jan has actually asked BALLE lately too. So Stacy, what about that? So say you're going to a locally owned store, but then you're using your credit card from a national bank. Are there studies about that leakage?
A number of years ago, there was a Leaky Bucket. I think that's what it was called, Leaky Bucket study in Vermont. But this is going back. Yeah, it's going back maybe 10 years. And I'm pretty sure, and my memory is fuzzy, but I'm pretty sure that it actually did look at maybe the question of those bank fees, those fees that are charged on credit cards. But that's the only one that I know of. There are certainly estimates out there, and actually we've got some articles on our site about credit card swipe fees, and you could look at debit cards as well. It's pretty much the same story. Credit cards are actually a bit worse, about the total amount that costs every year. And so you could probably do a pretty good estimate, sort of looking at what's your population size, so what percentage of those national fees are could reasonably be assumed to be coming from your community, and you could assume that most of those dollars are leaking. Many local banks and credit unions offer credit cards, and so as part of when people think about moving their money, we say don't just move your checking account, also move your borrowing. Make sure that you're moving your credit cards. If it's feasible, look at refinancing loans, like even your mortgage you might want to refinance with a local bank or credit union, other types of loans. So getting a local credit card is a good place to start. Encouraging people to use cash is a great thing to do. And then we're also big advocates for federal legislation to eliminate the monopoly that Visa and MasterCard have, and to push back so that they can't charge those high swipe fees. In Europe, because of laws there, swipe fees are a fraction of what they are in the U.S., and it's a competitive, robust market. So there's no reason to think that we couldn't do that here and save consumers a lot of money and local businesses a lot of money.
Well, that is terrific to know, because as Jan is making the point here, even if you're using a credit card from your local institution, the processing is done outside of the community because of the monopoly that you mentioned. So it's great to know that there's models from other countries where that's not the case, and that ILSR is doing some advocacy work there. We haven't talked a lot about your advocacy work, but I will encourage everybody who's interested in that work, again, to refer to Stacy's website about the great advocacy work that they're doing as well. So with that, I have a couple of closing reminders, and then we're basically at time. Again, after each webinar, we email everyone registered a link to the webinar recording for you to use, again, however you see fit. We also include a PDF copy of Stacy's slides and a copy of the questions in the chat window. So you should watch for that from Allie Walker on the BALLE staff over the next couple of days. Reminder that you can purchase our webinars individually, or you can buy 3 at a time for a significant discount. So there's more information on our website. And finally, we're always looking for ways to keep people in conversation. So our affinity groups are intended to connect you to your peers based around topics of shared interest, like Local First. So there is a Local First affinity group if you would like to continue the conversation and have access to your peers to kind of kick around ideas, ask questions. So there's more information on our website, or you can email Martin, who's with us today on the webinar, martin@balocalist.org for more information. So Stacy, we thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise and just your long-running dedication to local ownership. And we thank everybody else who's joined us. We've even got some folks with us from as far away as Pakistan. So we are delighted to have you all with us, and thanks for your questions. And we hope to have you all join us next month as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care. Happy Tuesday.